Well, for more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Professor of Political Science at the University of South Africa, Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. I know you've had a good review of the main parts of this latest installment. Just give us your overall impression of what you've seen.
Well, quite a number of things. I think in this, the recommendations by the Commission is more specific than those of the previous parts, the 3 parts. As you've indicated now, some persons are mentioned by name. The recommendations are also that they must be investigated, and when there's apparently sufficient evidence that's available. Also some recommendations with respect to state-owned enterprises like Eskom specifically, and especially about the 2014 board of Eskom. Also the fact that they came to the conclusion that the board in general did not comply with the different legislation that governs them, and therefore that they must be investigated, plus then the executives that you've referred to. At the same time, in the case of Zizi Kotwa, I think it's important because he's the Deputy Minister of State Security in the Office of the President, and the recommendation is that he must be most possibly released from his position. So it's very specific. It's different from the previous volumes or the previous parts, as they call it, because it's less on specific on institutions, about the SOEs, for example, or some of the different political of the government departments. The first part is, for example, about the Treasury, and it involves evidence from the Director General, then as well as the Minister, the previous Minister Pravin Gordhan, and the Deputy Minister Mcebisi Jonas and others. So there's a lot about the infrastructure, the financial management infrastructure of government. But they did not provide much recommendations about that in terms of where those procedures and legislation that exist is either sufficient or insufficient in order to prevent all these things that happened. I think what is important is that they say in the final part they will provide some recommendations about how the different state-owned enterprises should be composed of, especially the boards of these SOEs, as well as the appointment procedure of them, and those of the top management, the CEO and the chief financial officers and others. So that's still coming, the recommendations. But otherwise, that part is not so extensive as the identifying persons that have been implicated in this.
The inquiry was into allegations of state capture. Does this chapter, this volume, again say that state capture happened beyond the shadow of a doubt? I
think so. In this part or volume, there's quite extensive reference to the Gupta family again. In the previous 2 or so, it wasn't so much, but it comes back in a sense to their point of departure and also the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry to look specifically at state capture. In other parts, there was more going into the dynamics and the way in which the different state departments function, the decision-making processes, the role of President Zuma and others. But I think here that becomes, again, quite specific about what we now have become used to as state capture. So the conclusion, I think, is without doubt very, very clear. And the persons who, according to the Commission, have been instrumental in that have also been identified. So I would say in general, the Commission have to a large extent met the expectations of identifying persons and the processes that sort of developed over time to explain to us what exactly is or was state capture.
President Zuma has been mentioned before, but this is quite damning. You know, to say that he would do anything to help the Gupta family state capture project, that's quite a damning statement.
Yes, that is indeed so. And there's quite a number of references to the fact that he did not provide evidence to the commission. And therefore, his voice, to a large extent, couldn't be heard in this. But that was obviously his decision. But I think, especially in the section on the Treasury, it's the first volume of this fourth part, there's quite extensive discussions and evidence presented about, for example, the way in which he dealt with the Treasury, how he wanted to take away the budgeting process away from the Treasury to the office of the President, the dismissal of Nhlanhla Nene, the appointment of Des van Rooyen, the way in which he dealt with Minister Pravin Gordhan, Kabisi Jonas also, how they were dismissed. All of that is dealt with in quite detail. So I think the role of President Zuma in this is very clear. It is set out quite clearly. And therefore, it would have been actually so important for him to have his counter-argument or counter-narrative in order to be able to present both sides. But that obviously wasn't possible.
Eskom wasn't the only entity in this report. Take us through the other findings. Estina was interesting, wasn't it?
Yes, that as well as Alexkor, which is a relatively small company, a diamond company, at the mouth of the Orange River, but it has been also implicated in that. So what we are saying in the case of Estina, as we know, is the dairy farm project that was supposed to be developed in the Free State. And it's in a sense case studies over and above the well-known ones like Transnet or Eskom or the others, of how the notion of state capture, of corruption, of using state entities in order to get access to contracting processes, of becoming involved in actually dealing with their assets, to have their hands on their assets. That was sort of taking place during this time. Even therefore, the relatively small entities, but in the end, like Alexkor, but in the end, then, for example, Estina, which was a specific project, dairy project in the Free State, how that simply couldn't get off the ground, and that the money that was earmarked for it never reached the end goal or the end destination, but rather were diverted over time into the pockets of the different persons who were aligned to either the politicians in the Free State or even at national level.
So the Estina story, there are some names that some people thought might be mentioned in the report, but they didn't come up.
Yes, in both Estina as well as in the asbestos project. And we know, for example, that there's an ongoing court case now. A number of persons have been charged, including Ace Magashule. And in the case of the asbestos, or the discussion of the asbestos project, his name is never mentioned in this report. So one wonders what will be ultimately the implications of this for the court case that is still pending or still sort of in abeyance to a large extent, and which involves him. But it is quite, or the report is simply silent and does not refer at all to him in this context.
One of the Gupta brothers has been recommended for prosecution as well. Yes,
Tony Gupta, and that is in the context of the Treasury and specifically then Deputy Minister Kabisi Jonas. And I think everyone knows now already this what happened, where he was invited to the Guptas and offered the position of to become Minister of Finance, and in return for that, he will be paid millions of rands. Yeah. And the conclusion or the recommendation of the Zondo Commission is that he must certainly be investigated by the NPA. Whether that is feasible is obviously a different matter because he's not in the country, and whether that will be at all possible, therefore, is a different matter.
So this is another installment, another chapter. When you look at it all so far, what do we need to make of what we're seeing and how state capture could have possibly happened? And we talk about 15 billion rand in dodgy deals at Eskom alone. That is an incredible number, and it could not have happened without some serious permission.
Yes, that I would say is very striking about this. But I think the approach of this commission's report is to identify individuals, to say, well, this is not necessarily a systemic problem. It is about how a particular legislative and constitutional and the government system has been abused. So even if a system works well, there are still gaps that can be abused or exploited by persons if, and I think this is the important qualification, if the authority for it comes right from the top. And I think this is what made this investigation and also what we've heard in the media and the books that have been written about it. So an enormous task is the fact that it's not individuals at the lower level, maybe ministers or senior officials in government, that were involved in this on their own, but it actually started at the top with President Zuma. And from there, it involved the ministers as well as senior officials in government, as well as private companies, private businesses. So it's a network, it's a hierarchy and the network that were constructed over time, which actually influenced all dimensions of the public sector, of the public society, if one can use that word. And it is therefore became possible. And I think what we have also seen is to what extent, how much money was available in the different sectors, in the different state-owned enterprises, in the different departments, and how much of that could disappear over time by simply sort of developing an alternative form of decision-making processes. Because that's to a large extent what happened is that there was the formal structures of government, but in many instances they were not used. Alternative procedures, alternative institutions were used informally in order to make this possible. But ultimately, it is because the persons at key points within the government, the public sector or the government structure were participating in this and made this possible. And I think this is the extensive nature of this is why it qualifies to be called something like state capture and not simply corruption.
So it was clear that this went on for a good number of years. Is it fair to say that a general culture of corruption developed over time? The lens that we're looking at perhaps might be through the Gupta's interactions with the state and various departments, but could it be something that's crossed quite wide and to even the most remote areas, tiny little districts, little municipalities, that this general culture of corruption started to become rampant far and wide?
Yes, I think that's the big danger. And that is that as this became known within the government circles at the different levels, whether it's national or local government, it started to develop almost a culture to say, but this is possible and there's not going to be serious consequences. So it moved away from simply something built around the Gupta family. And what we've seen, and as we are at the moment, that take, for example, what happened during the time of the COVID and the PPE corruption that is now been identified by the SIU. That has nothing to do with the Guptas anymore. But it is a culture of entitlement, a culture of taking, in a sense, risks, in a culture of claiming that it is now part of the political procedure, the political dynamics, that politics is associated with money. And political positions can give you access to different sources of money. That has become, to a large extent, now accepted as part of politics in South Africa. And I think this is where the driving initiative from someone like President Ramaphosa is trying to break that culture, to say, well, there's more risks now involved. If you want to become involved in this, there's a real danger that you can be caught and that you can be arrested, and it can be the end of your political career. I think just maybe to deviate a little bit from this particular point, but for example, the stepping aside rule that has been now, in a sense, amended to say that persons cannot be elected to political positions anymore if they have stepped aside. That is the type of risk that I'm talking about. You know, that you are going to lose your political position and your political career if you are caught or if you are implicated in these things. But that's an exceptionally difficult process to go through. In countries like in Kenya, for example, they've introduced a special office in order to be able to fight corruption. And that first incumbent had to flee the country ultimately to London. In other countries like Nigeria, they had the same experiences. So for us to be able to really to be effective in this means that there must be a comprehensive campaign, comprehensive approach right from the top, from the presidential level right down to the local level. And if that doesn't happen quickly, then that culture can become embedded, it can become entrenched in society, and then it's almost impossible to get rid of it.
Professor Dirk Kotze, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you always for giving us insightful thoughts about this and other issues as they come up, but particularly this latest chapter in this state capture report. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's UNISA's Professor Dirk Kotze speaking to us about the latest installment of the state capture report, and it's not great reading. Senior executives at Eskom named, recommended for prosecution, and once again, our former president seemingly in the thick of things.